So what do Dutch schoolbooks say about the Netherlands' dark past? In the previous videos, we touched upon the dark history of the Netherlands. For example, the slave trade. The Dutch shipped over 500,000 African slave-made people across the Atlantic Ocean. It was done by the WIC, the Dutch West-India Company. But what do Dutch school children learn about the Dutch slave trade? Are school kids here in the Netherlands learning enough or too little? Well, I'm a history teacher and I'm going to tell you all about that. Now this here is the Dutch school system, but no, I'm not gonna bother you with that. Now before we're gonna dive into the juicy stuff, I do need to mention the following system. So depending on which level you're at, secondary school, you can opt for 4 years, 5 years, or 6 years. If you do the 6-year course, so to say, you get access to university. In recent years, the Dutch government implemented so-called time periods. In Dutch, we call these tijdvakken. These time periods start with the time of the hunter-gatherers, then you have the classical period, the early, then late Middle Ages, and it goes all the way till the time period of television and computer. These time periods are also used on primary school, by the way. Now we're going to look at the following two. The time of the regents and the monarchs, 1600 till 1700, and the times of Whigs and revolutions, from 1700 till 1800. And nope, I did not make these names up. But I do have to say that in English they sound pretty cool. But maybe that's because everything in English sounds cool. Now each time period has several characteristic aspects with it. So looking at the time period 7, Whigs and revolutions, there is aspect 30, which is the expansion of European domination, in particular in the form of plantation colonies and the associated transatlantic slave trade and the rise of abolitionism. These characteristic aspects are linked to core concepts, like in this case, plantation colonies, transatlantic slave trade, and abolitionism. So yeah, Dutch pupils do learn about the Dutch slave trade, but as you know, history is all about the nuances. So let's take a closer look at the history textbooks, what they are actually learning. Now this book here, Sporen, Traces, this is the book that I learned from when I was in secondary school in the year of 2000. Yep, it's a while back. So there's one chapter, East and West India, and it states on page 116, because of the peace with Spain in 1648, the WIC stopped waging war. Instead, it made way for the slave trade. Next paragraph speaks about the person's experience. First, it mentions the horrifying fate of the Indian population and the Americans, and gives us this scheme about the trading routes on different nations and what they traded. Next page are some interesting sentences. Slaves were treated far more inhumane under its European owners than under its African bosses. Now it's quite interesting, I like this nuance, that they write about European owners and African bosses. So if an African has a fellow African as a slave, then that African is a boss, and when a European does the same thing, it's an owner. During the sea voyage to Suriname that lasted more than 6 weeks, an average of 20% of the slaves died. Upon arrival, the survivors were in bad shape. Now in here you see a picture of the transport and also different eyewitness accounts. One boy who was sold as a slave and one by a Dutch commander on Fortress of Elmina. And here it gets interesting because here there's an assignment where the pupil has to study the two different perspectives on the slave trade and had to mention a true thing in both of the perspectives. So not only the horrifying nature of the slave trade is touched upon, also the concept of multiple perspectives. And I think that's the best way to learn about it, because honestly, I can't remember that much from high school, but I surely did remember the lessons about the slave trade. So I therefore say that this book did a fairly good job. Now this book here is not in use anymore, so let's take a look at a recent book, and I'm talking about Geschiedenis Werkplaats, History Working Place. And this paragraph right here elaborates on the previously mentioned characteristic aspect, the expression of European domination, and it's named colonialism and slavery. It states, over the course of 350 years, 11 million Africans made a forced crossing. The Portuguese and the British transported the most slaves. Dutch ships transported 550,000 slaves. Okay, now here it becomes interesting. This, the crossing over the Atlantic, was an outright hell. The Africans weren't treated as humans, but as cargo that had to be stored efficiently. In overcrowded spaces, the stench was terrible, and there was a lack of clean drinking water and food. Yet, the captains tried to keep the slaves alive as best they could. Slaves were worth money. The death rate among the slaves that were transported by the Dutch was 14%. That's a lot, but among the crew, there was a similar death rate. So you can see there's room for nuances here. Okay, so the next page elaborates on the life of the slaves. It says female slaves were often raped. It elaborates on how the Dutch initially condemned the slave trade. Christians don't take people, but after the Dutch captured Brazil and they had a lack of working force, they started to use slaves, especially when they conquered the fortress of Elmina of the Portuguese. And when it comes down to the attitude of the ordinary Dutchman, it's sad a few Dutch actually bothered about the slaves in Dutch colonies. Oh, and one interesting fact that I read in this book was the following. It writes about the disaster journey of the Dutch ship Eva Susanna, which arrived in Paramaribo, Suriname, 1726, with only 31 slaves alive from the 217 that went aboard in Africa. Yet, I did some further research and found out that the writers in the schoolbook made a mistake, because not 31 of the 217 slaves were alive, 31 of the 217 slaves died, and 186 were alive. Accidental mistake? Or not? Well, that's up to debate. Now, interesting enough, when I reviewed the school year with a few of my pupils, I asked them to what extent they found that they had learned sufficient about the dark Dutch past. And some of them actually said that, yeah, we didn't learn that much about the Dutch slave trade, although we did spend a full lesson on that. But some of them, yeah, they wanted more. And that's a very reasonable demand. You can say, why don't we spend 2, 3, 4 lessons on the Dutch slave trade? And if you look, for example, in this book, it's only a very short fragment about the slave trade. It's to the point, yes, but it's fairly short. And is that because they want to silence this sad period in the Dutch history? Is it because I don't want my pupils to learn about this and I'm actually a fervent nationalist and that I wave this flag behind me every day? Well, no, obviously not. The thing is, as a history teacher, you have so much material to cover that it's virtually not possible to spend more lessons on such a topic, on any topic. I'm already happy that I can treat the topic at all. So in conclusion, I think that Dutch historical textbooks do a fairly good job when it comes down to covering the Dutch slave trade. Now, if you want to know more about this slave trade and want to learn more about the company that's facilitated this, the Dutch West India Company, you can click right here. Also, check me out on Patreon, because with your donations I can keep doing this and expand. I want to thank you for watching. Do not forget to subscribe. Until next time.